The morning sun hadn't yet crested the hills when Maria Rodriguez's alarm buzzed at 4:30 a.m. She silenced it quickly, careful not to wake her three children sleeping in the small bedroom they shared in their modest two-room house. The floorboards creaked softly beneath her feet as she made her way to the kitchen, her movements practiced from years of early morning routines. Through the small window above the sink, she could see the vast expanse of land stretching out behind their humble home, land that had been in her family for generations. Now only a tiny portion remained theirs, a painful reminder of a past when their family thrived here. The rest of the land had been sold off piece by piece over the years, lost to rising debts and bad harvests. Maria lit the gas stove and placed a battered kettle over the flame. The hiss of the flame filled the quiet space. On the counter, a small sack of beans and a few tortillas sat ready for breakfast. She pulled a shawl around her shoulders, its fabric frayed but warm, and glanced at the clock. Another day of hard work awaited her. Her youngest child, Mateo, stirred in his sleep, his coughing breaking the silence. Maria froze, listening to the dry, rattling sound, worry flickering across her face. She couldn't afford another visit to the clinic, not with their mounting bills and the fine looming over their heads. She moved back to the stove, her hands working deftly to prepare the simple meal. Her calloused fingers bore the marks of years spent laboring on the fields, yet she carried herself with a quiet dignity that belied their circumstances. No matter how hard life became, Maria prided herself on keeping her family together. "Buenos dias, Mama," came a soft voice behind her. Maria turned to see Elena, her eldest daughter, already dressed in her school uniform. At just 14 years old, Elena had taken on responsibilities far beyond her years. "Buenos dias, mija," Maria replied with a tired smile. "Did you sleep well?" Elena shrugged, her gaze drifting toward the stove. "I can finish breakfast if you want, Mama." Maria shook her head. "No, no. You focus on school. That's the most important thing." Elena didn't argue, though Maria could see the worry in her daughter's eyes. The whole family knew about the fine they couldn't pay, though Maria had done her best to shield her children from the worst of it. By the time the sun fully broke over the horizon, breakfast was ready, and Maria had packed small lunches for her children. She walked them to the bus stop, her hand resting protectively on Mateo's shoulder as he leaned against her. "Study hard," Maria said as the bus arrived, her voice firm with encouragement. "Remember, education is your way out of this." The children nodded, their expressions somber. As the bus disappeared down the dirt road, Maria stood for a moment, staring after it. The weight of the day ahead pressed down on her shoulders. The small courthouse in town was a world away from Maria's quiet home. Its polished wood floors gleamed under the fluorescent lights, and the walls were lined with plaques and portraits of stern-looking officials. Maria sat in one of the hard wooden benches near the back, clutching a worn leather folder filled with documents. The room was crowded with people waiting their turn before the judge, a man with a reputation for being unyielding, especially toward the poor. Conversations buzzed around Maria, but she sat silently, her heart pounding. At the front of the room, Judge William Carter presided over the cases with a brisk efficiency that bordered on coldness. His silver hair was perfectly combed, and his tailored suit spoke of wealth and power. Carter was known for his strict interpretations of the law, and his rulings often favored the wealthy landowners and developers who wielded influence in the county. "Maria Rodriguez," the clerk called. Maria rose, her legs trembling as she approached the front of the courtroom. She felt every eye in the room on her as she stood before the judge's bench. "Mrs. Rodriguez," Judge Carter said, glancing at the papers in front of him, "you are here regarding unpaid fines on your property. Is that correct?" "Yes, Your Honor," Maria replied, her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her. "These fines have been pending for over a year," Carter continued, his tone clipped. "The county assessor's office has reported encroachment violations on your property, as well as delinquent taxes. You are required to pay the sum of $3,500. Have you made arrangements to settle this debt?" Maria tightened her grip on the folder in her hands. "Your Honor, I don't have that kind of money right now, but I have documents here that show—" Judge Carter raised a hand, cutting her off. "The law is clear, Mrs. Rodriguez. These fines must be paid within 30 days, or your property will be seized and auctioned to settle the debt." The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Maria's vision blurred for a moment as she struggled to process what she just heard. "Please, Your Honor," she said, her voice shaking. "This is my family's home. We've lived there for generations. I have documents." "The time for documentation has passed," Carter interrupted. "You've had ample opportunity to resolve this matter. Next case." Maria stood frozen, unable to move. A bailiff gently touched her arm, guiding her back toward the gallery. The courtroom around her seemed to spin, the voices of other plaintiffs and defendants blending into a dull roar. That evening, Maria sat at the small kitchen table, the folder of documents spread out before her. Elena sat beside her, studying the faded papers with a furrowed brow. "Mama, look at this," Elena said, pointing to a map of the property. "This line here, this is where the boundary used to be, right?" "Yes," Maria said quietly. "That's the original boundary. My father showed it to me when I was a girl." "Then why does the surveyor's report show it here?" Elena asked, pointing to a different line that cut into their property. Maria shook her head. "I don't know, but I don't think it's right." Elena's eyes flashed with determination. "We need to fight this, Mama. We can't just give up." Maria sighed, exhaustion weighing heavily on her. "It's not that simple, mija. The judge doesn't care about what's right. He only cares about what's legal." "Then we'll prove it's legal," Elena said firmly. "What about the old deeds? The ones Abuelito kept in the attic?" Maria's eyes widened. She had forgotten about those. "I'll check," she said, rising from the table. She climbed the narrow stairs to the attic, her heart pounding with a mixture of hope and desperation. The attic was cramped and dusty, filled with boxes of old family belongings. Maria dug through them, her hands trembling. Finally, she found it, a stack of papers tied together with twine. She carried them back downstairs, her fingers trembling as she untied the bundle. As she unfolded the documents, her breath caught. There, in faded ink, was the original deed to the land, signed by her great-grandfather nearly a century ago. The description of the property matched the boundaries she remembered from her childhood, not the ones in the surveyor's report. "This is it," Maria whispered, tears welling in her eyes. "This proves the land is ours." Elena leaned over the table, her eyes scanning the paper. "Look, Mama, there's even a clause here about the boundaries being protected in case of sale. They can't take this from us." For the first time in weeks, Maria felt a glimmer of hope, but she knew the fight was far from over. The next day, Maria visited the town library, where she sought help from Mr. Alvarez, the elderly librarian who had known her family for years. He listened intently as Maria explained her situation, his kind face creased with concern. "These documents are important," Mr. Alvarez said, examining the deed carefully, "but you'll need more than this to convince the judge. You'll need to prove that the surveyor's report is fraudulent." "Fraudulent?" Maria repeated, frowning. Mr. Alvarez nodded. "I've heard rumors about surveyors in this county. Some of them take bribes to alter property lines, especially for wealthy landowners. It might be worth looking into." Maria left the library with a renewed sense of purpose. If she could prove fraud, she might stand a chance. But the thought of going up against the judge and the system he represented filled her with dread. Later that evening, Maria's neighbor, Mrs. Jenkins, stopped by with a basket of fresh vegetables. The older woman had lived in the area for decades and often shared stories about the community's history. "I heard about your trouble with the judge," Mrs. Jenkins said, her voice kind. "Thought you could use these." "Thank you," Maria said, accepting the basket gratefully. Mrs. Jenkins hesitated, then said, "You know, I remember when that judge bought his property. It used to belong to the Delgado family. They lost it during the drought back in the 70s. Maria frowned. "The Delgado family? They owned land near ours?" Mrs. Jenkins nodded, her eyes narrowing as she thought back. "Yes, their land bordered yours to the east. Beautiful property, but they fell on hard times. That judge got it for a steal." Maria's heart skipped a beat. She hadn't thought much about Judge Carter's property before, but something about Mrs. Jenkins' words gnawed at her. Could it be connected to their land in some way? "Do you remember anything else about it?" Maria asked carefully, her mind racing. Mrs. Jenkins tapped her chin. "Well, now that I think about it, I remember your grandfather saying something about how the Delgados never actually sold part of their land outright. Something about a lease or agreement? It's fuzzy, But if the Delgados leased it instead of selling, that might have carried over to you. Maria nodded, her thoughts spinning. If there were a legal agreement tying the judge's property to theirs, it could explain the discrepancies in the land boundaries. The next day, Maria and Elena worked tirelessly to dig deeper. Maria called relatives, searching for anyone who might have knowledge about the old agreements, while Elena used the library's archives to search for historical land records. By evening, Elena rushed into the house, clutching a faded ledger she'd found in the archive. "Mama, look at this!" she exclaimed, setting the book down on the kitchen table. Maria leaned over the book, her eyes scanning the handwritten entries. There, among the names and transactions, was a notation about the Delgados' land being leased to the county for courthouse construction decades ago. "This means the land wasn't sold," Elena said, her voice shaking with excitement. "If this is true, the boundaries might never have been updated legally." Maria nodded slowly. "And if the lease included terms protecting our land, then the current surveyor's report is invalid." Elena frowned. "But how do we get the judge to even look at this? He's not going to listen to us." Maria's gaze hardened. "We'll make him listen, but we need help." The following day, Maria visited a local legal aid office where she met with a young attorney named Carla Morales. Carla listened attentively as Maria laid out her case, her eyes lighting up with interest. "This is big, Maria," Carla said, flipping through the documents. "If we can prove that the surveyor's report was altered and that the original lease agreements were violated, we can challenge the fine and possibly even reclaim the full property." Maria felt a flicker of hope but quickly suppressed it. "Do you think we can win?" Carla smiled, her expression determined. "It won't be easy. The judge has a lot of power, and he won't like being challenged. But with the evidence you've gathered, we have a fighting chance." As the fine deadline loomed closer, Maria and Carla worked tirelessly to prepare their case. Late into the nights, Maria pored over documents, her exhaustion forgotten in the face of the fight for her family's home. Meanwhile, Carla uncovered troubling evidence about the county surveyor. Several landowners had accused him of taking bribes to alter reports, though none had been able to prove it. "This is our angle," Carla said one evening, her voice firm. "If we can show that the surveyor acted improperly, the judge will have no choice but to reevaluate your case." But Maria knew it wasn't just about winning her case. It was about exposing the system that allowed people like Judge Carter to exploit families like hers. The day of the hearing dawned cold and overcast, the sky heavy with dark clouds. Maria stood outside the courthouse, her breath visible in the crisp air. She clutched the folder of documents tightly, her hands trembling slightly despite her resolve. Elena stood beside her, her chin held high. "We've got this, Mama," she said quietly. Maria nodded, taking a deep breath. "Let's go." The courtroom was as imposing as Maria remembered, but this time, she felt a spark of determination she hadn't felt before. She took her seat beside Carla, who organized their documents with practiced efficiency. When their case was called, Maria rose, her heart pounding as she approached the bench. "Mrs. Rodriguez," Judge Carter said, his tone as cold as ever, "you are here to address the matter of unpaid fines on your property. Do you have any new information to present?" Maria glanced at Carla, who stepped forward confidently. "Your Honor," Carla began, "we have uncovered significant evidence suggesting that the fines imposed on my client are based on fraudulent surveyors' reports and outdated property boundaries. Furthermore, we have documents proving that the land on which this courthouse stands was leased, not sold, from the Delgado family, whose property boundaries overlap with my client's land." A murmur rippled through the courtroom as Carla presented the documents. Judge Carter's expression darkened, but he said nothing, his eyes scanning the papers with increasing tension. "We also have evidence suggesting that the county surveyor altered reports in favor of wealthy landowners," Carla continued, her voice steady. "We request a full review of my client's case and an investigation into the surveyor's practices." The tension in the room was palpable as Judge Carter leaned back in his chair, his face unreadable. "This is a serious accusation, Counselor," he said finally. "It is, Your Honor," Carla replied, "but the evidence speaks for itself." Maria held her breath as the judge studied the documents. She couldn't see his face, but she could sense his unease. Finally, he spoke, his voice clipped. "I will review this evidence and make a determination. Court is adjourned. As the gavel struck, Maria felt a surge of relief mixed with uncertainty. The fight wasn't over, but for the first time, she felt like the odds were in her favor. Outside the courthouse, Maria stood with Carla and Elena, the cold wind biting at their faces. "You did amazing, Mama," Elena said, her voice filled with pride. Maria smiled, her heart swelling. "We did this together, mija. No matter what happens, I'm proud of us." Carla placed a hand on Maria's shoulder. "This isn't just about your family. What we're doing here could set a precedent for others in this community. You're making a difference." Maria nodded, her resolve firm. No matter what came next, she knew they were on the right path. The stakes had never been higher. But Maria and her family weren't just fighting for their home. They were fighting for justice. As the storm clouds gathered above, Maria felt a quiet strength rising within her. This was her land, her family's legacy, and she wouldn't let it go without a fight. The courthouse bustled with activity the morning after the preliminary hearing. Maria stood at the foot of the courthouse steps, clutching her bag of documents. Her hands trembled, not from fear, but from the weight of everything riding on the day. The murmur of passers-by filled the air, punctuated by the clinking of heavy boots on marble floors as courthouse staff hurried past. "Elena," Maria whispered, looking down at her daughter beside her, "remember what we practiced. We speak clearly, keep our heads high, and never lose our dignity." Elena nodded, her jaw set with determination. "We've got this, Mama." Inside the courtroom, Maria took her seat beside Carla. Across the aisle sat Judge Carter, a look of cool indifference etched across his face. His attorney, a sharp-looking man with graying temples, leaned over to whisper something into his ear. "Ready?" Carla asked, adjusting her glasses as she organized their stack of evidence. Maria nodded, her lips pressed together. "As ready as I'll ever be." The clerk called the case to order, and the proceedings began. Carla stood first, outlining their argument with methodical precision. "This is a case about justice, Your Honor," she began, her voice steady. "My client's land has been her family's legacy for generations. Yet today she faces ruin based on an unjust fine derived from a fraudulent survey. This is not just a mistake. It is a systematic failure to protect the rights of vulnerable citizens." Judge Carter shifted in his seat, his eyes narrowing. As Carla spoke, she projected the surveyor's report onto a screen for the court to see. "This document claims the Rodriguez property encroaches on county land. However, our research shows discrepancies in the boundary lines dating back decades. We have evidence proving these boundaries were improperly redrawn to benefit Judge Carter when he acquired his property." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Maria glanced at Judge Carter, who maintained a stony expression, though his attorney's frown deepened. "Mrs. Rodriguez," the opposing attorney interjected, standing with a dismissive wave of his hand, "has no formal claim to contest these boundaries. This case is a baseless attempt to avoid paying her fines. The surveyor's work has been verified." Maria's heart sank at his condescending tone, but Carla didn't flinch. "Your Honor," Carla said calmly, "we've uncovered evidence of misconduct by the county surveyor. Multiple landowners have raised complaints about altered reports. This is not an isolated incident." The judge leaned forward, his gaze sharp. "Do you have documentation to back these allegations, Counselor?" "Yes, Your Honor." Carla handed a thick file to the court clerk, who passed it to the bench. "These are affidavits from other landowners, along with financial records suggesting irregularities in payments made to the surveyor's office." As the court adjourned for the day, Maria felt a flicker of hope. But outside the courthouse, reality loomed. "Mama, how are we going to survive if this drags on?" Elena asked, her voice trembling. "The fine's deadline is in 3 days. If we can't pay, they'll take everything." Maria sighed, her shoulders heavy. "We'll figure something out, mija. We always do." That night, Maria sat at the kitchen table, counting every last dollar she had. The pile was pitifully small, barely enough to buy groceries, let alone pay a fine. Elena entered the room, her expression thoughtful. "Mama, what if we hold a community meeting? Let people know what's happening. Maybe someone will have more information about the land or the judge." Maria hesitated. Asking for help wasn't easy, but they were out of options. The next day, Maria and Elena distributed flyers across town, inviting neighbors to a gathering in their small yard. By evening, a dozen people had gathered, their faces lit by lanterns as dusk fell. "Thank you for coming," Maria began, her voice steady despite her nerves. "My family has been fighting to save our home. We've uncovered evidence that the land survey used to fine us was fraudulent, and we believe Judge Carter has been abusing his position to benefit himself." Gasps of shock rippled through the group. An elderly man named Mr. Garcia stepped forward. "I've known the judge since he moved here. Always thought there was something fishy about how he acquired his land. My father used to say it belonged to the Delgados, but no one ever talked about how it changed hands." Another woman chimed in. "I remember hearing rumors that the Delgados never sold it outright. If that's true, there must be a paper trail." Encouraged by their support, Maria spoke up. "If anyone knows anything, old stories, documents, anything, it could help us, please." One by one, the neighbors shared what they knew. Though most had only fragments of information, it began to paint a picture. Decades earlier, the Delgados had leased part of their land for county use, but Judge Carter had acquired it under suspicious circumstances. The next morning, Maria and Elena returned to the courthouse archives, armed with the names and dates their neighbors had provided. Hours passed as they sifted through dusty files, their eyes burning from the strain. Finally, Elena let out a triumphant cry. "Mama, look at this!" Maria hurried over as Elena pointed to a faded deed. It detailed a lease agreement between the Delgados and the county, with clear stipulations that the land could not be sold without written consent from the Delgado family or their heirs. "This is it," Maria whispered, her heart racing. Elena frowned, pointing to the bottom of the document. "But look, there's a signature from a Delgado family member. Do you think it's real?" Maria examined the signature closely. Something about it seemed off. "We'll need Carla to verify this. If it's forged—" Her voice trailed off, but the implication was clear. Back at Carla's office, the young attorney examined the document with a critical eye. "If this signature is forged, it could invalidate Judge Carter's claim to the property entirely." Maria felt a surge of determination. "What do we do next?" Carla leaned back, her eyes sharp. "We request a forensic analysis of the signature. If it's proven fake, we have grounds to not only challenge the fine, but also demand an investigation into Judge Carter's dealings." 2 days later, the results came in. The signature was indeed forged. Carla wasted no time filing a motion to present the evidence in court. But as the fine's deadline loomed, Maria's nerves were frayed. If the judge delayed the hearing, they could lose everything before the truth came to light. That evening, Maria gathered her children around the dinner table. "No matter what happens tomorrow, remember this. We've done everything we can, and even if we lose, we'll still have each other." Elena reached across the table, squeezing her mother's hand. "We're not going to lose, Mama. We've come too far." The following morning, the courthouse loomed before them, its marble steps slick with a faint drizzle that had begun to fall overnight. Maria's heart raced as she entered the building, her breath coming in shallow bursts. The fine's deadline was mere hours away, and the hearing, which would decide the future of her family's land, was about to begin. "Do you think they'll really listen to the evidence, Mama?" Elena asked quietly, her eyes glistening with a mixture of hope and worry. Maria turned to her daughter, offering a reassuring smile, though doubt still gnawed at her inside. "We've done everything we can, mija. Now it's up to the judge and the truth." Elena nodded but kept her gaze on the floor, her footsteps slow. Inside the courtroom, the tension was palpable. The room was packed with observers, neighbors, members of the press, and even a few local activists. The air buzzed with murmurs, the low hum of curiosity and anticipation. The judge was seated at the bench, his expression unreadable. Maria took her seat beside Carla, who was flipping through their documents for the umpteenth time. "I'm confident," Carla whispered, "but I need you to be ready. When I present the evidence, it's going to hit hard. We need to stay focused." Maria nodded tightly, trying to calm the racing thoughts in her mind. The hearing began, and Carla rose to present their case. "Your Honor, the Rodriguez family has been unfairly targeted by both the surveyor and the judicial system. We found evidence that the boundaries of their land were altered without their knowledge, and more importantly, the documents we've presented show that Judge Carter's acquisition of the land he currently owns was not entirely legitimate." There were gasps from the crowd, a buzz of whispers filling the room. Maria could feel the weight of their eyes upon her. She kept her back straight, her chin lifted, even as her heart beat rapidly in her chest. Carla continued, "The signature on the deed of transfer is a forgery. It does not match any known signatures of the Delgado family. We are requesting a full investigation into the matter. If the deed is found to be invalid, Judge Carter's claim to the land is null, and the fines levied against Mrs. Rodriguez and her family must be immediately lifted." Maria's eyes flicked to the judge, who was now staring down at the papers, his face still unreadable. He cleared his throat before speaking. "I will need time to review these claims. This court will reconvene in 1 hour." The air in the room thickened as the judge left the bench. Maria sat motionless, the weight of the moment heavy on her shoulders. In the hallway, Maria and Carla stood in silence, exchanging only a glance. There was nothing more they could do now but wait. "I don't think he'll let this go easily," Carla said quietly, "but we've got him cornered." Maria nodded, though her insides felt like they were made of lead. The clock ticked mercilessly on. After what seemed like an eternity, they were called back into the courtroom. The judge had returned to the bench, and this time there was a strange tension in the air. The murmurs had died down to a low whisper. "After reviewing the evidence," Judge Carter began, his voice colder than ever, "I have come to a conclusion. The signature in question is indeed a forgery, and the documents do not match the official records." Maria's breath caught in her throat. This was it. The judge paused, his gaze moving over the room, lingering on her. "However," he continued, "this does not immediately invalidate the entire transaction." A wave of disbelief swept over Maria. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice trembling. Judge Carter continued, "While the signature is false, the court is not convinced that the land was illegally transferred. The terms of the lease and subsequent actions are too ambiguous. For now, I will suspend the fine pending further review of the land's ownership status. But I will also require a full investigation into this matter before any further action can be taken." The words hit Maria like a blow. Her stomach twisted in knots as she exchanged a look with Carla, whose expression was one of restrained frustration. "So we're still left in limbo?" Maria whispered almost to herself. Carla nodded, her lips tight. "The judge is buying time. He's stalling, Maria. He's buying himself more time to figure out how to cover his tracks." The judge's gavel struck with finality, and the court session adjourned. As they left the courtroom, Maria was consumed by a cold rush of disappointment. "We're back to square one," she said, her voice hollow. "We don't even have a clear decision." Carla placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. "I know it's frustrating, but this isn't over. The fact that he has suspended the fine means we have room to breathe. We can keep pushing forward. This just means we need more evidence." Maria nodded slowly. "More evidence," she repeated as if the words held some power. But how much more could they uncover? Days stretched into weeks as Maria and Carla dug deeper into the case. They interviewed more witnesses, tracked down additional records, and consulted with legal experts who could help substantiate their claims. The weight of their task pressed down on them, and Maria found herself growing weary. The uncertainty of the situation wore on her, yet she kept moving forward, knowing the stakes for her family were too high. Elna's face had begun to pale from the late nights and tension, but she never once faltered in her support of her mother's fight. "We're getting closer, right, Mama?" she asked one evening, as they pored over another stack of documents. Maria didn't answer right away. The truth was, she wasn't sure anymore. The closer they got to uncovering the full extent of Judge Carter's involvement, the more powerful and untouchable he seemed. But then one evening, Maria received an unexpected call. It was Mrs. Jenkins, the neighbor who had first mentioned the Delgado's lease agreement. "Maria, I remembered something," Mrs. Jenkins said, her voice urgent. "You need to get to the county clerk's office immediately. I think I found the missing link." Maria's pulse quickened. "What do you mean?" "Just get there," Mrs. Jenkins urged. "I think I know who signed off on the transfer, and it's not Judge Carter." Maria didn't waste a second. She grabbed her coat and rushed out the door, her heart pounding with anticipation. The clerk's office was almost deserted when Maria arrived, save for a few people filing paperwork. Mrs. Jenkins was waiting for her, a look of excitement on her face. "I found it," she said, handing Maria a manila folder. It's the original transfer form for the property Judge Carter acquired. And look at this. Maria opened the folder, her breath catching as she scanned the documents. There, in bold lettering, was a name she hadn't expected. Ruth Carter. Maria's mind raced. Ruth Carter, the judge's sister. A quiet woman, well known in town, but not someone who had ever seemed involved in real estate transactions. What does this mean? Maria asked, her voice trembling. Mrs. Jenkins smiled grimly. It means that Judge Carter didn't directly acquire the land. His sister did, and we have proof that she sold it to him for a fraction of its worth under suspicious circumstances. Maria felt the ground shift beneath her. This wasn't just about land. It was about power, manipulation, and systemic corruption that ran deeper than she had ever imagined. With the new revelation in hand, Maria returned to Carla, who immediately recognized the significance. This is what we've been waiting for, Maria. With Ruth Carter's name on this document, we can prove the land wasn't properly transferred. And if we can prove corruption, the judge's entire position is in jeopardy. Word spread quickly through the community, and soon more neighbors came forward with stories of questionable dealings involving Judge Carter. Maria and Carla worked tirelessly to prepare the final evidence. The pieces were all falling into place, but there was still one question lingering in Maria's mind. Would it be enough to make the judge face the consequences? The days following the discovery of Ruth Carter's name on the deed were a blur of meetings, legal filings, and community support. The Rodriguez family was no longer alone in their fight. Their neighbors, emboldened by the evidence, had rallied behind them, making the case one not just for the Rodriguez family, but for the entire community. But Maria could not shake the feeling of unease. She had seen the lengths to which the judge had gone to protect his interests, and now, as the final court date drew near, she could not help but wonder if the system would truly deliver justice, or if it would shield one of its own. On the day of the final hearing, Maria stood before the courthouse, feeling the weight of the world upon her. The air was still, as if even the wind understood the gravity of what was about to unfold. The once sturdy structure of the courthouse now seemed imposing, a monolith that towered over the small figures who walked its halls. She was no longer just a mother fighting for her children's future. She was a symbol of the struggle against corruption, an unwilling pawn in a battle that could alter the course of her entire community. Elena stood beside her, clutching her mother's hand. "Mama, do you think we'll win?" she asked softly, the anxiety clear in her voice. Maria squeezed her daughter's hand. "We've done everything we could, mija. The truth is on our side. Whatever happens, know that I'm proud of you, proud of all of us." The doors to the courthouse swung open, and they entered together. The courtroom was already packed, the familiar faces of their neighbors and supporters filling the benches. The tension was palpable. Judge Carter had not yet arrived. It was as if the room held its breath, waiting for the final confrontation. Carla was already at the front, discussing strategy with the team of legal experts who had been working tirelessly on their case. She gave Maria a reassuring nod as they took their seats. The moment was drawing closer, and the stakes had never been higher. When Judge Carter entered the room, the murmur in the crowd grew louder. He strode to the bench with his usual confidence, but today his movements seemed less certain. His eyes flicked to the Rodriguez family, then quickly turned away. There was a moment of stillness, an almost imperceptible pause before the proceedings resumed. The judge cleared his throat, his voice colder than ever. "We are here today to finalize the decision regarding the claims made by the Rodriguez family. The evidence has been reviewed, and I am prepared to make my ruling." Maria's heart beat faster, but she refused to let her nerves show. She sat tall, her back straight, her gaze fixed on the judge. Carla gave her a subtle nod. They were ready. The judge's gavel struck sharply. After extensive review of the evidence, it has come to light that the transfer of property that Judge Carter, through his sister, Ruth Carter, acquired was indeed not conducted in a proper legal manner. The documents presented were forged, and the circumstances surrounding the transaction raised questions of legality and ethics. Maria felt a rush of relief, but the storm was far from over. The judge continued, his voice steady, but his eyes darting nervously. "Therefore, the original transaction is voided. Ruth Carter's deed, as well as the subsequent sale to Judge Carter, are hereby annulled. The land in question is to be returned to its rightful owners, the Rodriguez family. A wave of disbelief swept over Maria. She could barely process the words, but they were undeniable. The judge had just announced that they had won. The courtroom erupted into a chorus of applause, a loud, resounding noise that filled the room. Maria's heart swelled as she turned to face the crowd. She saw tears in Elena's eyes and felt her own throat tighten with emotion. But it was the look on Judge Carter's face that captivated her. He sat frozen, his eyes wide, his hands gripping the sides of the bench as if the world had just tilted beneath him. Maria met his gaze, and for the first time, she saw a flicker of something: fear, guilt, perhaps even shame. He swallowed hard, his lips pressed into a thin line. But then, to her astonishment, he stood, pushing back from the bench with an almost violent movement. "I protest!" he shouted, his voice trembling with fury. "This decision is an outrage!" The room fell into stunned silence. Maria felt her breath catch as she watched the judge's face contort with rage. "You may protest all you want," Carla said sharply, rising to her feet. "But the facts have been presented, and the law is clear. You've abused your power for too long, Judge Carter. It's over." Maria's heart beat faster as she turned back to the judge. She could hardly believe what was happening. His empire of power was crumbling, and it was all coming down in front of her. But then, unexpectedly, something changed in the judge's demeanor. The fire in his eyes seemed to fade, replaced by something softer, almost regretful. He seemed smaller now, his posture slouched, as if the weight of the truth had broken him. He looked at Maria, and for a brief moment, their eyes locked. I never meant for it to go this far," he muttered almost to himself. "I thought I was just securing a future for my family." Maria's gaze softened, though she held her composure. "Your future came at the cost of others, Judge. What you've done to us and to this community is unforgivable. But today, justice has been served." The judge stood motionless for a long moment, his hands shaking as he reached for his gavel. It fell with a resounding echo, finality in the sound that reverberated through the courtroom. "I hereby declare this case closed," he said, his voice now a mere whisper. "The Rodriguez family will receive their land, and all charges against them are dropped." As Maria and her family left the courthouse, the weight of their victory began to sink in. The streets outside were lined with their supporters, all cheering and clapping. They had not only won the land back, but they had exposed the corruption that had run unchecked for so long. The Rodriguez family was no longer just a family struggling to survive. They were symbols of the power of community, of the strength that came when people united against injustice. Maria felt a profound sense of peace as she stood outside the courthouse, Elena by her side, the land that had always belonged to them, now truly theirs. "Thank you, Mama," Elena said, her voice filled with awe. Maria smiled, wiping away the tears that had begun to fall. "It's not just me, mija. It's everyone who fought with us. Today, justice won." As the crowd around them began to disperse, Maria took one last look at the courthouse. The doors had closed behind them, but she knew this was just the beginning. The system had been shaken to its core, and though it was uncertain what the future would hold, Maria felt a renewed sense of hope. Judge Carter had been brought to justice, but the true victory lay in the change it had sparked within the community. In the end, the fight for fairness was never just about one family. It was about restoring dignity and equity to all. The days following the courtroom victory felt like a dream to Maria. Her family had reclaimed the land, but the weight of everything they had been through still hung heavy in her heart. There were moments when she would catch herself smiling, the joy of their victory sweeping over her in waves, but the memories of the past few months, of fighting against the system, of seeing the judge's arrogance, and then the shame in his eyes, reminded her that the journey was far from over. As the days passed, the community began to rebuild in ways that were both unexpected and hopeful. The news of Judge Carter's misconduct spread quickly, igniting a fire within the people. The support for the Rodriguez family only grew stronger as neighbors and local leaders rallied around them to ensure that the land would not only be theirs, but would remain in their hands for generations to come. Maria's once fragile house now felt like a fortress of strength. The small two-room home, nestled on the edge of the land they had inherited, stood as a symbol of their resilience. Every time she looked out over the rolling fields, the same land that had been a constant reminder of their hardships, she now saw a future that had once seemed impossible. Meanwhile, Judge Carter's life was unraveling. The very system that had once protected him now turned against him. He had been forced to step down from his position, a public disgrace that could not be undone. The power he had once wielded so effortlessly had been taken from him, and he was left to face the consequences of his actions. In the months that followed, Judge Carter withdrew from the public eye. His once grand mansion sat empty, a silent reminder of the life he had once enjoyed. The shame that hung over him was palpable, and though some tried to defend his past decisions, the evidence was too clear. The people saw through his facade, and they could no longer ignore the damage he had done. Maria, however, was not concerned with his fall from grace. She had already forgiven him, not for his actions, but for her own peace of mind. The justice they had fought for had been served. What was more important to her now was the future, her children's future, the future of their land, and the future of their community. As the seasons changed, Maria found herself walking the land that was now truly hers. The weeds that had once overtaken the fields were slowly being cleared. The soil once neglected was being tilled, and new life was beginning to grow. The farm, which had been nothing more than a dream during their darkest times, was now becoming a thriving reality. Elena had grown into a young woman over the course of the ordeal. Her face, once full of the worries of a child, now held the quiet strength of someone who had witnessed the depths of both human cruelty and human kindness. She walked alongside her mother, helping to plant the first of many crops that would grow in the fertile soil. "I'm proud of you, Mama," Elena said one evening, as they looked out over the fields at sunset. "You did what no one else could. You fought for us, for everyone." Maria smiled, her heart swelling with pride. "It wasn't just me, Mija. It was all of us. We couldn't have done it without the people who stood by us, without the community. We all fought together, and that's why we won." But even as they celebrated their victory, Maria knew that the fight for justice was far from over. The case against Judge Carter had been just one example of the corruption that existed within the system. His downfall had sparked something much larger, a movement that was beginning to change the way the community viewed power and fairness. The fight wasn't over for just one family. It had ignited a spark for everyone who had ever been wronged by the very systems meant to protect them. In the months that followed, Maria, with the support of Carla and their neighbors, began working to ensure that the land would remain in the hands of families like theirs. They started a cooperative, a collective effort to maintain the land and use it for the good of everyone. The people who had once been ignored, oppressed, and pushed to the fringes were now empowered, their voices heard, their rights respected. As the cooperative grew, so did the impact it had on the surrounding area. Maria's work to rebuild the farm turned into something larger, a thriving agricultural hub that supported not just her family, but many others who had been struggling. The land that had once been used for profit by powerful men like Judge Carter was now used to feed, educate, and support the community. The courthouse, which had once symbolized the system that had kept so many down, became a place where new justice was being sought. Instead of being a place of power for a few, it became a place where the voices of the oppressed could be heard. Carla continued to fight for systemic change, working with local officials and lawyers to ensure that what happened to the Rodriguez family would never happen again. And as for the judge, his life became a cautionary tale. His former colleagues, once his allies, now distanced themselves from him. The wealthy and powerful, who had once relied on his favor, turned their backs, and Judge Carter was left to face a lifetime of quiet reflection on the choices he had made. Maria never sought revenge. In fact, she had long since stopped thinking of him as an enemy. Her thoughts were consumed with her children, her community, and the future they were building together. There was no joy in his downfall for her, only a quiet satisfaction that justice had been done. It was late one afternoon when Maria stood at the edge of their property, Elena at her side, as they looked out at the land that stretched out before them. It was the same land that had once been a battleground for power and greed, but now it was theirs. It belonged to them and to everyone who had fought alongside them. "This is our home," Elena said softly, her voice full of reverence. "We're not just survivors. We're builders, Mama. Maria nodded, her heart full of pride and love. She thought back to all they had been through, the struggle, the injustice, the pain. But she also thought of the victory, the redemption, and the hope that now filled their lives. They had not just won the land. They had reclaimed their dignity, their place in the world. They had shown that no matter how powerful the system or how long the road, justice could prevail. And as Maria looked over the land, she knew that they had not only secured a future for themselves, but had changed the course of history for their community. This was their victory, and it was one that would resonate for generations to come.